I want to talk about ballet's history, but I want to give you a bit of a disclaimer. First of all, this is a very brief history. This is intended for a worldly arts class, a very general art appreciation course. And with that in mind, let's jump into the history of ballet. Now, ballet can tell us a great deal. It can tell a story, it can express an emotion, it can reflect a piece of music, or simply showcase a choreographed series of movements. At the heart of the classical dance form, however, is a bit of deception. We get this idea of these incredibly graceful ballerinas, but in reality, we know that ballet is physically brutal, that it contorts the dancers into movements that are unnatural for the human form. And this is actually going to be a limiting factor for any ballet dancer, be it a male or female. So, because it demands the utmost commitment, willpower, and strength for at most a few decades that dancing is in the spotlight, it's really more similar to something like athletics, football, or basketball, where you only have a short amount of time where you're at your athletic peak, and after that, well, you need to come up with other plans. And we see the same thing in ballet. You don't see 60-year-old ballet dancers at the top of their game. So when you look at this form of dance, you really need to look at as much of an athletic endeavor as an act of grace and movement. Now, a well-executed ballet will transport the audience into a fantasy world where dancers defy gravity as they leap, maintain balance during dizzying spins, glide along their tiptoes, and rise into the air as if light as a feather. A fine ballet is graceful and natural. And although it may encompass incredible technicality and difficulty, a ballet's audience is only ever aware of its ability to personify or evoke emotion. Emotions from rage to jealousy to love, simply through the movements and lines of the dancers' bodies. It is this illusionary fantasy world that has enthralled audiences for centuries. And this is what I'm going to explore. I'm going to start in the 15th century and come up to modern day, looking at a brief history of ballet. Ballet has a rich history dating back to the 15th century. It will begin with the court ballets that we see in 15th century Italy. Court ballets will be dazzling spectacles lasting for several hours, and they were performed for and by the nobility. Now, they serve a purpose. The ability to understand and learn specific dance moves, while it seems minor today, would be a way of determining who is in and out at court, who knows the right things and who doesn't. And so it's a form of control. It's just like dinner manners and knowing which fork to use at dinner, and that being used to determine what social class you belong to when you go out with someone. Well, it's the same thing with these court dances. If you were the right people, or amongst the right people, or one of the right people, you knew the dances. You took the time to practice them, you knew how they evolved, and you knew what the latest craze was and could perform it appropriately. So it's all about categorizing people into classes. In the 16th century, we will begin to see vocabulary being set for what we would term ballet today. In 1547, Catherine de' Medici became the Queen of France. Her family ruled Florence and were known as patrons of the arts, including early dance and ballet. Catherine then married the French king and brings ballet to the French court. In 1581, we see one of the earliest ballets commissioned by Catherine, Le Ballet de Comique de la Reine. It was 5 hours long and incorporated dance, song, and special effects. It's really a mix of opera and ballet. Many of these new ballets will focus on Greek stories and themes, another influence of Catherine, bringing that Greek influence from the Renaissance Florence into France. So with that in mind, let's explore some of the vocabulary of the period. When we look at it, we have a series of movements that will begin to be used. These included movements for the feet, arms, and head, all in French because of the French influence behind it. So we see the plié, to bend, relevé, to rise or lift, the ensemble, to assemble or put together, and pirouette, to turn on one foot. We'll also see rigorous technique developed, which will require many hours daily to become proficient, and these are still being put on by nobles. This is not a professional class of dancer. Therefore, we still have that categorization of the noble into those that know and those that don't. By the 17th century, ballet becomes a viable art form, and we're going to see it shift and change. Louis XIV is going to play a major role. He's going to revive French interest in the ballet, which had waned since Catherine. Now, the Sun King greatly enjoys dance. In his younger days, fitter days, he would take part in ballets given at his court. This is one great example, this costume, as he's dressed as the Sun King, with massive suns attached to his knees, a giant buckle, and the buckles of his shoes, in entirely gold. This would have been remarkable and not that unusual. After all, monarchs all had their interests and wanted to show their abilities. Now, he will use dance specifically to control his court. Where you dance and your skills determined your powers with the king. Not a new idea. But it's kind of funny because courtiers were so busy learning the dances that they did not have time to plot against him. It's possible that this was a form of control. This was a nudge. And he does other things similar to this. His morning routine, where people will vie to be the first one into his room to say hello to the king. All sorts of things that Louis is using to control the courtiers around him. Now, in 1661, he will establish the first ballet school, l'Académie Royale de Danse, to train dancers to perform for him. This is going to be the beginning of professionalization in ballet. Around 1670, we see Pierre Bouchon, who develops and codifies the 5 classical ballet positions at the Académie. And you'll notice that his illustrations are of men, not of women. Men play the primary role, or at least an equal role, throughout early ballet. And we see this example from his codification. Now, we run into a problem with dance, and it is, how do you record it? After all, today we use video and that sort of thing, but 200 years ago, when that doesn't exist, you're always looking for how to record movement. We've had musical notation going back to the Renaissance and earlier, but we haven't had dance. So he's attempting to codify it using certain symbols to give the idea of movement and trying to teach people the right movements. And this is supposed to assist in the mouth-to-ear teaching that is so common to the time. In other words, one instructor who knows it, passing it down. The problem is that can act like a game of telephone, and movements can change over time, which Bouchon does not want to see. In the 18th century, things will change again. For example, the emphasis on technique is no longer a priority. Now they're focusing on meaning and message. They're trying to get across a story. Now, we're going to see professionally developed French ballet dancers begin performing publicly around 1708, and similar dance troupes develop across the continent and moving eastward, including the acclaimed Russian Imperial Ballet of St. Petersburg, which will be founded in 1738. Though early dancers wore heavy, elaborate costumes and floor-length skirts, the increasingly skilled and technically accomplished dancers demanded costumes that did not hide or interfere with their movements, and this is going to be a major issue in the period. For example, famed ballet dancer Marie Salé dons flowing robes inspired by the ancient Greeks, which we see there on the left. This would give her the ability to move, but of course it's a lot of extra fabric. Her rival and contemporary, Marie Carmaggio, shortens her skirt above her ankles, puts on tights, and removes the heels from her dance shoes, effectively creating the first ballet slipper, which is going to be a big move, and it's the sort of thing that starts here in the 18th century but becomes far more important later on. Another set of rivals, choreographers Jean-Georges Novare of France and Gasparo Angiolini of Italy, separately developed a dramatic style known as Ballet d'Action. Where early ballets were court entertainments that encompassed dance, theater, and singing, Ballet d'Action tells a story through dance step and movement. So this is where we're getting into the narrative ballet. We're getting away from the abstract form. Now, Novare will reject opera ballets, this idea of mixing song and dance and theater into one form. Instead, he promotes ballet as a distinct art form. This is the first time that ballet is going to take on its own form, its own codification. In his 1760 book, he criticizes the past style of dance that uses masks, wigs, and bulky costumes to portray characters. After all, those are antithetical to what you want to do in dance, which is focus on movement. Instead, he urges dancers to use only their bodies and faces to convey emotion and to become the character. This is where we start to simplify the costume, and we move towards what will be, in the modern day, very neutral or very basic colors, a skin-tight leotard and a tutu, something that is predictable really no matter what ballet you go to see. So what he's doing is he's creating the story ballet or the narrative ballet. This is where we start taking that plot model that you've probably seen in literature or other forms, and we apply it to ballet. And of course, if you're applying a story or narrative, it makes a lot of sense. You're going to have your inciting incident, your confrontation, your climax, decision, resolution. You're all familiar with this, more than likely from an English class. But we aren't at the end. There's a long way to go. In the 19th century, things change again. Audiences begin to abandon ballets inspired by Greek myths or dramas in favor of more romantic creations, fairy tales, love stories, and escapist tales of dreamlike worlds or faraway lands. Between 1820 and 1830, Italian dancer, teacher, and choreographer Carlo Blasis writes extensively about ballet history and theater, and will codify the technique of ballet. The Romantic period influences ballet technique and fashion by inspiring the point shoe, which lifts female dancers and portrays them as heavenly beings. What they're doing is they're giving them this sense of grace and impossibility. By walking on their toes, we know that that's particularly difficult, but it gives it a sense of grace as if they're floating above the stage itself. It also elongates the leg and focuses us on their movement, whereas a flat shoe doesn't do it to quite the same extent. We also see the development of tutus, which completely free the legs. There's now no encumbrance over the leg, preventing it from moving through its usual range. Female dancers will gain importance over their male partners, and the concept of the prima ballerina is born. This is the first time that women are taking the stage above the men in ballet. Previous to this, or prior to this, it's generally fairly equal or male dominant. In the 19th century, we see romantic ballets characterized by the use of mythical creatures and places. Now, Romanticism is the basis for this. This is an artistic and literary movement where they focus on the macabre, the sublime, things that don't exist, on fantasy. And that's exactly what we're seeing in romantic ballet. Now we're going to see choreographers such as the Italian choreographer Taglioni, who will create in 1832 what is considered the first romantic ballet, La Sylphide. In it, The star, who happens to be his daughter, Marie, changes ballet fashion by dancing the whole role of the fairy-like being, dressed in a lightweight, white, calf-length skirt, and a top that bears her neck, arms, and shoulders, again, focusing on the idea of movement and being able to see that as an audience. His dreamlike dance style is later rivaled by the Austrians and others. So, what do we have? By the time we get to 1847, we see French-born dancer and choreographer Maurice Petipa, who joins the Russian Imperial Ballet of St. Petersburg, which would become the Kirov Ballet and helps the city become the ballet center of the world. Petipa introduces a rigorously trained corps de ballet, which I'll define in a moment, and creates some of the form's enduring works, including Don Quixote, The Sleeping Beauty, and restagings of Giselle, La Safide, and Swan Lake. His roles typically showcase lead ballerinas and would continue to be amongst the most desired parts for more than 150 years. Now, when we look at this period, we're really looking at what some term classical ballet. And we're going to see, for example, elaborate costumes, far more elaborate than what we would typically see today, even though they're simplified from what they used to be. The storyline will be that of a fairy tale, a fable, something that can't happen in real life. It requires us to suspend our belief in reality, to suspend reality for a period of time, and really dance does that well. After all, most people don't see dancers popping down the street. And we'll see dancers divide into three categories for most of these shows. We will see the leading roles, the principals. We will see the soloists, who are solo and character roles. And we will see the corps de ballet, which I brought up a moment ago, which are the remaining members, primarily working in large groups on stage, oftentimes acting as, well, basically part of the scenery. We'll also see the development of the grand pas de deux, which is a step for two, most prescribed and the most prescribed movement in any performance. It always follows a specific form. We have the male and female enter. They perform a slow duet, followed by a solo variation for each, and a final coda or duet. The role of the male is now to support the female in difficult moves. His solo variation is where he gets to show off his own technique. And we're going to see all of these forms in some of the most famous classical ballets, such as The Sleeping Beauty by composer Peter Tchaikovsky, where a princess is under a spell and the kiss of a prince revives her. This, of course, will be made into the Disney movie at a later date. We see Swan Lake, again with Tchaikovsky, where a swan turns into a woman, falls in love, she and her lover commit suicide to be together in the afterlife, a little bit dark. And we will, of course, see the Nutcracker, which we see many different choreographers, many different variations, but it's basically all existing within a dream, fitting that romantic theme that we typically see of fantasy, dream worlds, the sublime, etc. In the 20th century, things will change again. We're going to see Sergei Diaghilev, who will establish the Ballet Russe in 1909 and employs Mikhail Fokine as a choreographer. Now, Fokine advocates dancers using their entire bodies, as opposed to separate gestures, to express emotion. Among others, he creates The Firebird in 1910, enlisting composer Igor Stravinsky to compose original music for his ballets. Now, beginning around 1910 or so, modern dance develops in Europe and North America, and will play into ballet, or really come out of ballet. Declaring themselves independent of ballet, proponents often state vehement opposition to the classical form, calling it unnatural and a form of torture. And we're going to see pieces like this is from Stravinsky's Rites of Spring, where we see these movements, they're definitely not ballet-like. We see that development of modern dance coming out of ballet. Now, ballet enthusiasts disparaged the newer form as barefoot ballet. During and after the 1917 Russian Revolution, some of the country's finest dancers will immigrate to the West, join or develop troupes, and open ballet academies. Their contributions to North America and Europe elevate ballet skill in countries like the United States and the UK to levels comparable to the acclaimed Russian troupes. These Russian dancers often dramatically increase worldwide audiences for ballet. In the 1920s, dancer, choreographer, and theorist Rudolf von Laban will begin to develop something called Labanotion, a system of dance notation used to record or make a blueprint of dance choreography. Now he's doing the same thing that people have tried to do before. He's trying to create a sense of notation. Interestingly, his sense of notation will also be used by sports teams and others to look at general human movement. It will eventually become a method of recording all body movement and is also used to analyze movements in sports and in industry when they were looking at industrial efficiencies back around the turn of the century, the 1920s and such, and they're looking at the movements of individual factory workers and trying to create as much efficiency as possible. Now, following his move to the United States and a job choreographing at the American Ballet Company, the country's first major ballet school, former Belarus dancer George Balanchine will co-found in 1948 what would become the world-famous New York City Ballet. Choreography begins to explore more and more abstract dance techniques through this period, without or with less dependency on plot or storyline as an expression of the movement. So what they're doing is they're trying to create a study in a particular style of movement. And this is expressed in works like 1957's Agon, one of many collaborations between Balanchine and Stravinsky. So what they're doing is they're looking at more abstract ideas. They're not worried about an overall story. They might be looking at an idea like love, death, or movement, something broader and more out there. And they're looking for it to be at some level an expression of the music, but this is where ballet will start to move away from the necessity for music. Now, by the 1970s, many ballet and modern dance groups had eliminated their rivalry, and both began to incorporate each other's techniques in new productions. So while modern dance grows out of ballet, it will grow back into it, inspiring new forms, new movements, and new ideas, which gives us contemporary ballet. Now, the focus in contemporary ballet is on the movement far more than the story. If you have a story, it's going to be an abstract concept, not a specific story that's trying to be illustrated in dance. Now, although some basic vocabulary exists and carries over from the classical, here we see more twisting and bending of the upper body, more use of the upper body. We see no core. Instead, all dancers are equal. There's no star system. There's no prima ballerina. Classical will use pantomime and literal gesture, whereas contemporary generally does not. It's not necessary because I'm not trying to get across a story. So I don't have to mimic poisoning someone or drinking something or stabbing someone, or I seem to watch a lot of violent ballet, but there used to be those. It used to happen. We also see the elimination of grand pas de deux. So that idea of the duet form with that very specific set of movements. So as we move into contemporary ballet, you're seeing something that is far more open. Instead of constantly trying to codify, it's constantly looking for new ideas to bring in, and that's not surprising in the modern world. Now, we can expect, looking at history, after all, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. What we can expect is for ballet to go through these cycles, where it's going to become more liberal, bring in new ideas, and then it's going to become more conservative and codify and go through this same cycle over and over again, maybe similar to jazz dance or other more contemporary forms.